Good afternoon, everyone. So it's 2:29. We're gonna wait another minute and we will open our second panel. So I hope you had a very, very good, nutritious lunch and a big cup of coffee, and you're ready to join us to what follows this afternoon. For the 7 of you who are in the room right now, I'm just gonna mention that we have another panel this afternoon. Tomorrow is slightly different because we have a couple of parallel panels, but towards the end of panel 3, Stephanie, who's chairing that panel, will tell us a little bit more about the housekeeping and what's happening afterwards. But I thought I'm just going to use this minute I have to introduce to what's happening. So the reason you see me in a different place, I'm still in lecture theatre, is because our first panelist, Dr. Andrew Stubbs, is here with me. So I think it's actually past, so I can officially start the introduction. So that's why we're going to be running the first panel together. So once again, officially, welcome to our second session at the second International Interdisciplinary Conference and Art Film Festival. It's a pleasure to open this session called Creation and Engagement. Again, we have 3 panels. Our first speaker, Dr. Andrew Stubbs, will be talking about talent, representation, and diversity. I'm just going to introduce, I'm going to invite Andrew to introduce himself and start his presentation. So, Andy.
Yeah. Should I share my screen?
If you want to maybe introduce yourself, and then we share your screen.
Okay, yeah, yes. Let's do it that way.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. As Agatha mentioned, my name's Dr. Andy Stubbs. I am a senior lecturer in film, media and communication at Staffordshire University, where obviously we're hosting the conference. I've published various articles, chapters, and I'm in the middle of writing a monograph for Edinburgh University Press in the area that I'm going to be speaking to you about today, which is talent representation, management, and screen authorship, really, particularly focusing in the areas of indie film, specialty film, and media, including television as well, quality television. So I'm going to be touching on a little bit of that today, but with more of a focus on diversity on screen and in production. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you all for being here today to listen to my presentation. I'm going to be exploring the operations of a single talent management and media production company, Macro, and the role of its CEO, Charles King. I'm going to be exploring and scrutinising how Macro has built its brand around advocating for greater diversity in media production and reflecting on what this indicates about the relationship between ideas of diversity and talent representation in Hollywood. To do this, I'll be conducting discourse analysis combined with some industry analysis by drawing on second-hand interviews and trade press reports. I'll finish with a brief analysis of a single case study, the 2021 feature film Judas and the Black Messiah, which you can see there on screen. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a bit of context. In media scholarship, the roles that talent intermediaries, such as talent agents and managers, play in production has frequently gone overlooked. In 2018, however, UCLA's annual Hollywood Diversity Report found that talent agencies and talent managers perform gatekeeping roles that contribute to the underrepresentation of women and people of colour in Hollywood production. A contributing factor here is likely to be that the number of Black people working as talent intermediaries in Hollywood remains disproportionately small. In a 2019 New York Times article, several prominent Black agents outlined the barriers that they believe are stopping more Black people from becoming agents. They stated that Black people often disproportionately lack the socio-economic capital necessary to undertake agenting internships, including the financial means to support themselves during training, that the larger talent agencies tend to recruit from elite schools while overlooking historically Black colleges, and that talent agencies tend to use networking as a means for recruitment, thereby creating barriers for Black people who usually do not already have connections in the industry. Notably, Black agents tend to stop short of blaming the lack of diversity on racism and individual prejudice. Rather than being indicative of an actual absence of racism in the business, however, Black agents' reluctance probably reflects the fact that successful talent agenting relies heavily on building interpersonal relationships. In her 2008 study of post-classical Hollywood, Denise Mann argues that talent did not gain absolute autonomy after they were released from long-term studio contracts, but rather that much of the control over their careers simply passed to talent intermediaries. In this context, the limited number of black agents in Hollywood risks restricting the visibility of people on screen and the authenticity of black filmmakers' stories. Without enough black agents, black actors, directors, and writers are more likely to be represented by white agents. Although white agents can undoubtedly be powerful allies, white representation of black artists as a consequence of a deficit in the number of black agents has significant implications. Indeed, white representation of black artists arguably represents a manifestation of what Monica White Ndunu calls Hollywood's plantation scheme. Hollywood's plantation scheme, Ndunu explains, is an ideology and pattern of production inherited from plantation arrangements where whites, including slave owners, use black bodies for white entertainment. The lack of evolved representations of African Americans as individuals with emancipated consciousness, especially in their interactions with whites in theatre and film, Ndunu argues, is symptomatic of the broader issue of plantation politics plaguing the development of African American characters in films past and present. Moreover, even if white producers see themselves as allies, Ndunu states they're seeing themselves working according to a progressive ideology can decrease the likelihood that producers question racist potential in production and reception. It is also worth pointing out that the limited number of black agents or agents of colour in Hollywood risks reinforcing impressions that that ideal agent is white. This idea about the ideal agent being white in a white-dominated system risks creating problems for the black talent intermediary who will strike a balance between being able to successfully work according to the rules of the larger system while depicting themselves as capable of fulfilling the specific needs of their clients who are often, though not exclusively, black. Drawing from Kenneth W. Mack's findings in his study of the first black attorneys in the United States, black agents appear caught between the needs of the white-dominated system and those of their own racial group. Black agents are required to appear simultaneously exceptional, representing the highest aspirations and the greatest potential of their social group, and authentic, someone as much like the masses of their social group as possible. It is within this wider context that a company such as Macro operates. Macro and its CEO, Charles King, at once adhere to the wider talent intermediary and Hollywood studio system, seek to differentiate themselves from Hollywood's established agencies, and accentuate the commercial and cultural possibilities for black talent and black-run intermediary businesses. Okay, so King founded Macro in 2015. To do so, Charles King exited William Morris Endeavor, Hollywood's largest talent agency, where he had worked since 1997, when he joined the agency's trainee program before rising through the ranks to become its first ever African-American partner. After establishing Macro, King took on the role of being the company's figurehead and the face of its brand. In doing so, King and Macro regularly invoke his agenting work to legitimate the company's purportedly socially driven mission and its credentials for spotting talent and mobilizing brands in the entertainment marketplace. Upon founding Macro, for instance, King stated, "There were two major catalysts that propelled me to move to LA and enter the industry over 15 years ago. My vision to build a media company one day, and the knowledge that what I saw on screen did not fully reflect the spectrum of who we are. It's clear to me now," he said, "as it was then, that there's a growing appetite for content that serves the more diverse world we live in." Elsewhere, King said of Macro's mission to create content with more diverse representation, "I've been sitting in these Hollywood rooms for the last 15 years. The studios aren't focused on it, the packages aren't focused on it, there's a huge void and a huge opportunity." King's comments capture neatly how the former talent agent frames Macro's mission in terms of its social and cultural benefit, while gesturing to its commercial potential. In 2019, Macro also expanded into talent management by launching M88. Since then, M88 has cultivated a client roster that includes Ryan Coogler, Michael B. Jordan, Donald Glover, Riz Ahmed, Naomi Scott, Gemma Chan, and Idris Elba. Upon launching M88, King announced that the management division aimed to amplify the voices of artists and creators from the global new majority. In turn, King stated that Macro is designed to be a disruptive company that not only participates in shaping and lifting culture, but also economically empowering people of culture. Accordingly, Macro's operations arguably represent an important break from industry and production norms. With a leadership team comprised mostly of people of colour and women, Macro represents a shift away from Hollywood's plantation modes of production. Moreover, the company's marketing discourse departs from the conventional Hollywood logic that films and television series with mainly black casts do not sell well internationally. Instead, Macro frames managing and producing projects with people of colour as an enormous global business opportunity. In doing so, Macro positions itself as offering greater employment and business opportunities to people of colour in the media industries, and in turn as offering more diverse and authentic representations of people of colour on screen. Macro's mission, therefore, appears highly commendable. Yet it is here necessary to take a moment to scrutinise more closely King's efforts to use his agenting work to legitimise Macro's mission. Indeed, it is highly significant that most information about King's agenting work has come from interviews that he has provided since establishing Macro. Such extra-textual discourse represents an effort to retrospectively shape a narrative about his agenting work that fits with Macro's purported mission. In 2017, for instance, King recalled that joining William Morris's legendary trainee program was a way to build relationships from the ground floor up to understand the language. King added that William Morris effectively dropped him into a pot of gold and asked him, "How much gold do you want to mine?" King says that uncharacteristically, he began signing clients and building relationships with William Morris executives even during his time working in the mailroom. King emphasizes that as the only African American in William Morris's trainee program, he had to work harder than his white counterparts. I had to read twice as many scripts. I came in early. I was the last one there. I came in every weekend. I was bringing in clients and cultivating business way before I was an agent. Asked what kind of conversations he as a mailroom trainee had with the chief executives of William Morris, King recalls having sent proposals and charts about the shifting demographics in the country and how youth culture is impacted by urban culture and how that was pop culture. Cultural shifts that were already happening in fashion and music, King says, were going to happen in film and television. Asked how his memos to William Morris executives were received, King asserts that they were well received, they understood. King reiterates some of these sentiments elsewhere when he states, and I'm going to read from the screen that you can see there, the leaders at the top of William Morris and frankly the senior chairman level of a lot of the studios that I would interface with, they would usually get it. A lot of times you find it's people in the middle that are less visionary. And so, yeah, of course, there were moments where I would be discussing things or bringing up concepts and meetings and literally got laughed at. And then a few years later, I was running the meetings because I was generating 10 times more revenue than they were. On one hand, King's comments are important because they highlight the barriers and discrimination that many black people experience in their working lives. King's comment about working harder highlights how black agents are expected to prove themselves as exceptional, while his recollection of being laughed at is another example of the isolation that black agents sometimes experience when working in a white-dominated industry. On the other hand, King's crediting of studio chairman and William Morris executives with vision and leadership is conspicuous for repeating what Amanda Lotz calls the great man myth. As Lotz explains, the great man myth is a narrative often disseminated in promotional discourse and industry biographies that depicts the executive as having successfully executed their vision. As the CEO of Macro, of course, King's crediting of media industry executives with vision reflects back onto him. King's reference to urban culture is vague. King's linking of urban culture and youth culture perhaps brings to mind the 1990s hip-hop gangster cycle and its films such as Boys in the Hood, New Jack City, and Menace to Society. In fact, King went on to negotiate deals for features such as Barbershop and Hustle and Flow that would broadly fit within this cycle. Significantly, though, many films of the hip-hop gangster cycle had already been released before King became a William Morris trainee. King's recollection of sending the agency executives charts predicting urban culture's influence on the mainstream, therefore, may be overstatement intended to position himself as always having been a disruptive figure in tune with cultural and market trends. Simultaneously, King's recollection indicates how he strategically navigated William Morris's corporate culture. King's comment about being understood by William Morris's CEOs can be interpreted in reverse to mean that it was he who understood what the agency's CEOs wanted. Indeed, King's comment about William Morris's trainee program providing an opportunity to understand the language indicates how talent agencies create institutional cultures that function to shape their agents. King's early agenting was also occurring in a broader context where multiculturalism and diversity had already begun to be reconceptualized within the Hollywood industries as marketable properties valuable for appealing to different niche demographics. Thus, King defines urban culture as part of a market trend beginning to have mass appeal. In these terms, it's hardly surprising that King's memos would be well received by agency CEOs seeking greater revenues through expansion into new markets. Rather than being a disruptive figure, King's emphasis on urban culture indicates how he may have adhered to white executives' narrow conceptions of blackness. As Charisse A. Harris and Monica White-Nadunu argue, Hollywood executives have privileged hip-hop gangster films due to their commercial potential derived from an appeal to black urban audiences and young white males. Hollywood executives have done so, Nadunu and Harris argue, at the expense of alternative stories and representations. King and in turn Macro may seek to advocate for black talent, therefore, but they do so within the restricted parameters created by the Hollywood agencies and studios. Okay, so what potential is there for King and Macro to shift these parameters and the narrative surrounding their work? To answer these questions, I'll now turn to Judas and the Black Messiah. Judas is a feature-length film that was released in 2021. The film depicts Fred Hampton, a former deputy chairman of the Black Panther Party, leading up to his eventual assassination by the FBI following a betrayal by informant and Panther infiltrator William O'Neill. The film was co-produced by Bronze Studios, Participant, Macro, and Proximity Media. Proximity is owned by King and Macro's client, Ryan Coogler, who directed Black Panther and took a producing credit on Judas alongside King. Judas was also co-financed by Warner Brothers, which acquired worldwide distribution rights. The film was directed by Shaka King, whose previous directing credits included one feature film, some short films, and various television episodes. Shaka King also co-wrote the screenplay with his regular writing partner, Will Burson, developing earlier drafts by brothers Kenneth Lucas and Keith Lucas. Significantly, Judas was also released after the murder of George Floyd by police officer Derek Chauvin and in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, when lockdown restrictions forced many cinemas to close. George Floyd's murder made the film highly topical in ways that increased people's awareness of racial inequalities and police brutality. Lockdown restrictions prompted Warner Bros. To release Judas on its streaming service, HBO Max, on the same day as in cinemas. In the promotion of Judas, Charles King, Shaka King, and Ryan Coogler repeatedly drew parallels between Judas's depiction of Hampton's struggle for social equality and the experiences of black filmmakers in Hollywood. On teaming up with Coogler and Charles King, for instance, Shaka King stated, "If you're trying to kick down heavy doors, you need bodies to go up against that door. And I needed, like, big dudes. So I got a big dude, Coogler, who I trust, whose politics I know are like mine." Meanwhile, Charles King asserted that raising finance for Macro to become a film financier was the hardest thing he has ever done. If the first black partner in the history of Hollywood, who represented some of the biggest names in our industry, launched as a company and still had challenges raising capital, that should tell you how challenged it is for access to capital for people who look like the three of us. Shaka and Charles King's comments clearly create an impression of these black men as struggling against and breaking down racial barriers. Shaka King explains that racial barriers were encountered when, upon attempting to sell Judas to the studios, he and his co-producers repeatedly received offers below the amount that they believed the film to be worth. In one negotiation, for example, King says that a studio executive made an insufficient offer after inputting data into an algorithm and determining that the movie would bomb. King says that he reminded the executive that the same algorithm had wrongly predicted that BlacKkKlansman, directed by Spike Lee, would fail at the box office 1 year earlier, stating that this all stems from mistruths in Hollywood that films with black casts perform poorly internationally. King says that it proves that even the math in Hollywood is racist. King's comments are supported by Nadunu's broader findings that distributors' assumptions that black cast films do not sell well abroad reduces opportunities for black talent and limits the budgets for the few black films, mainly cast films, that are greenlit. This is just one example of how Judas's marketing provided Charles King, Shaka King, and Coogler with an opportunity to raise awareness about the continued barriers that black talent face in Hollywood. With Judas acquired by Warner Bros., however, it is paradoxical that King has found space to make such comments in the promotion of a studio co-financed and distributed film. King's ability to do so confirms Etienne Quinn's argument that Hollywood's corporate fault lines provide opportunities for minority talent, mobilizing the rich performative and subcultural resources of Black America within the celebrity-fronted industry environment. With Quinn's comments in mind, I argue that the filmmaker's efforts to draw parallels between Hampton's struggle and the experiences of Black filmmakers in Hollywood serve several different functions. On one hand, drawing such parallels appears designed to potentially prompt social critique, mobilize individuals, and bolster support behind social equality activism. On the other hand, drawing such parallels provides various promotional and commercial functions. First, they promote Judas by increasing its investment in its narrative by signaling its continued social relevance. Second, they position Shaka King and his collaborators as Hollywood outsiders, struggling against the odds to create exceptional work. Although race and racial barriers are unusually foregrounded here, it is extremely typical for notions of the apparent dedication of the outsider artist to be emphasized in the promotion of indie or specialty Hollywood productions. Third, emphasis on social barriers, social activism, and coalition building creates investment in Macro's corporate mission and talent management business. It bolsters Macro's brand value, generates investment in its productions by increasing a sense of their worth, and encourages more talent to join its management divisions by reiterating the necessity of a cohesive Black and minority filmmaking community. Finally, all of these issues were encapsulated by Warner Bros.' decision to release Judas on HBO Max and in cinemas on the same day. For Warner, which released its entire 2021 slate on HBO Max as well, the decision to do so was an attempt to mitigate against losses in revenues from theatrical distribution while promoting and jump-starting HBO Max. As Macro was a co-financier and co-producer of Judas, however, the film's release on HBO Max severely limited the revenues that the company could earn by sharing in net profits. While emphasizing with Warner's market position by acknowledging that HBO Max lagged behind its major streaming competitors for number of subscribers, King states that he was initially concerned about Macro's potential returns and ability to repay their investors. Shaka King, meanwhile, responded to Warner's decision by pointing to a potential harm that it could have on Macro and the broader minority independent filmmaking community. Shaka King asserted, "Really look at the role that Macro plays in shepherding movies like this. If that company was not meaningfully compensated, the effect could be fairly disastrous to our filmmaking community." Warner's decision to release Judas on HBO Max, therefore, represented another hurdle in an industry where the working conditions of Black talent and producers is already more precarious than those of their white counterparts. Warner's decision to do so also provides a reminder of the precariousness of small and medium-sized enterprises, such as Macro, in a Hollywood industry where the major studios reduce their risk by signing unequal production and distribution partnerships. While Charles King claims that Macro is absolutely going to make the world a better place, its dependency on much larger media organizations for co-production and distribution represents a threat to its future success. While Macro may make positive contributions to the industry and culture by advocating for Black talent and stories, therefore, Black ownership of distribution infrastructure is still needed to drive more substantial change. In the meantime, perhaps Macro can continue to draw attention to the barriers it and Black talent face, and in doing so, strengthen their position by bolstering their brands. Thank you. And here are my references if you want to continue reading about this clearly fascinating topic. First page, and there's some more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. If you don't mind staying with me here for a moment, just make sure we stop sharing the screen. And what we'll do, we'll take a couple of questions, but perhaps I can start with asking you really, really fascinating presentation, obviously very much in line with what's going on currently, both in terms of our, in cinema, but also in the wider climate of what's going on. And you mentioned a couple of issues happening at the moment. I was wondering, how do you see the future of diversity in cinema in relation to talent management? What will be how do you think what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years?
I think it's hard to know. I think that there are signs that things are moving in the right direction. Since UCLA's 2018 Hollywood Diversity Report, there definitely seem to be some changes. Diversity in the industry has improved, not huge amounts, but it has improved. That's including people of color and women in production and in on-screen roles. In terms of behind the scenes in the industry, I think that in itself will go hand in hand to some degree with better, hiring of people of color and women as agents and in executive roles in the intermediary business. I always feel very cautious and want to be cautious about overstating change and making too many predictions because I can't see into the future. And in the past, where we have predicted change might come, it hasn't. There have been lots of key moments in history where we thought, okay, this is going to be a moment of change now, and
it happened afterwards. Yes, and of course, your main focus is Hollywood, and you're looking at the specific geographies here. Would you be able to comment a little bit about how it looks like on a more global scale?
Well, yeah. I think that my specialism is definitely Hollywood.
Yes.
In terms of the largest Hollywood talent agencies, they have offices around the world.
Yes.
So they have offices in the UK, in Europe as well. And they obviously, a lot of their practices then are the same in these places. Okay. In terms of some of the ideas that I've spoken about, there's some level of movement, I think, between Hollywood and the wider world in terms of talent. But often the direction of travel is from maybe, if we look at maybe Mexico, filmmakers, or Korea, the filmmakers kind of move often from those countries and then, almost to some degree of leave the countries in which they worked. And I think that can be a problem.
And I presume this is obviously a very different situation. So you usually have established directors from other places, which then are finding a temporary place in Hollywood and potentially going back to other places, which is a very different situation to someone who's just starting their career in the place of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the Hollywood talent agencies don't do a huge amount. It's something that they suggest that they're addressing, but they don't do a huge amount to enable mobility, social mobility, and then movement from underrepresented communities within their country, the US in this case, to progress and become more senior. What they do sometimes is they will, like I've just said, kind of hire from, Angli from the East and Quran from Mexico and, like we say, from Korea. And often as well, then that brings its own problems because what we've seen as I mentioned earlier, my area of expertise is maybe authorship. So we have like the idea of the auteur to some degree with world cinema. You see the idea of the auteur built around people of color in world cinema, but it's still often around men of color primarily.
Yes. So lots of limitations over there. It's a very, very interesting conversation. Again, I think it's almost for another paper. But what I think is important, with people like yourself who actually look into this idea of diversity with talent management, the discussion has been started, and that's always, of course, we're not going to change the world by discussing things, but by paying attention to and maybe pointing out to some issues and challenges over there. This is where we can start, make the first step towards some changes, which hopefully will follow at some point. Would you agree?
No, absolutely. I think that, as I mentioned, that UCLA Hollywood Diversity Report, which is now an annual report that UCLA do, I think that's really valuable in terms of shedding light on the lack of representation in the industry. But also, I think that what we have done in media and cultural studies for a long time is maybe been overly focused on representation in screen and not focused enough on economic access to capital that people have in production and in business ownership.
I couldn't agree more with you. And I think on top of that, so this is where the complexity grows in one level, but I think another thing is also, diversity, and hopefully this event here proves that it's not just about racial differences versus male versus female. And anything in between. There's many different layers, many different ways to understand diversity. How about representing people with different health problems or disabilities? And this again, like we could talk about it for quite some time. And as I said, like many sessions actually address that. But I think this is really important to address it. It's not just about one thing.
Absolutely. Intersectionality, I think, is key. I obviously, to make my paper manageable to a large degree, I focused on blackness and race, blackness especially. but you're absolutely right that those intersections and issues across and between, are really important. Yeah.
Absolutely. I realize I hijacked all the questions here, so we have another minute. So I'm just gonna see if there's any questions. I know that Stephanie is kindly enough to reply to some really important concerns and I can see we have our second speaker here already. So I'm just gonna see if there's any final questions from anyone in the audience. And of course, if you do have any questions which we don't have time to address during the session, please feel free to include them in the chat and we'll pass them on to our speakers. But I think we are fine for now. So once again, thank you so much, Andy.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you very much, Agata, for the introduction. It's a fantastic pleasure and an honor to be part of this conference. Thank you very much for all the work which organizers done, and especially to you, Agata. So yeah, in terms of my presentation, let me introduce myself first. So as Agata kindly introduced me, I'm Anna Paprocka, and basically I work as a film content manager, and I oversee the specialist programming across 9 European territories, and that involves specialist programming, so non-English language films, and as well special Q&A sessions, satellite screenings, which are run across all of those countries. So I attend the conference today as an independent scholar, and as I mentioned earlier, it's a great pleasure. So now just moving on to my presentation, let me share the screen, just bear with me. So first, I would like us to look at the reasons why the growth actually has been possible and the growth of Polish films in the UK. So there are some specific reasons, specific factors which make the growth possible. And one of them is the fact that on 1st of May 2004, Poland joined the European Union. And this meant that Poland was also able to benefit from 4 freedoms, and 4 freedoms of the single market. Free movement of goods, free movement of capital, freedom of establish and provide services, and free movement of persons. And one of the consequences of this change was the fact that the number of Poles living in the UK grew significantly. So in consequences, again, that meant that the demand for the Polish cinema increased significantly. Now, the second important factor was the fact that following the advent of the free market economy in 1989, it turned out that the communist era management style made Polish cinema incapable of self-financing through the exploitation of films. It was decided that films, being objects of cultural heritage, should be co-financed by the state. And in consequence, the Polish Film Institute was established in 2005. So as many of you presume know, the Polish Film Institute is a national film fund that offers comprehensive support for the Polish film industry, including film production, education and dissemination of film culture, and international promotion. Thanks to its work, the cinema landscape has significantly changed in Poland. One of its biggest successes was the increased number of premieres. Just to put things in perspective, to let you know, 40 feature films, 40 documentaries, and 22 animations were made just in 2019, thanks to the Institute financial support. And then when we talk about the factors which allowed the growth of the Polish cinema in the UK, it's also crucial to take into consideration the fact that Poland is one of the European countries where its inhabitants demonstrate a very strong willingness to watch local films. Unique the International Union of Cinemas, reported that in 2020, Poland was the second country in Europe with the highest percentage of tickets sold for local titles. In Poland, films in languages other than Polish are shown with subtitles. The culture of dubbing has never been established and popularized in Poland, obviously, apart from kids' films. Some see this fact as one of the reasons why local titles are so successful in Poland. They believe that the necessity of reading subtitles works as a deterrent for the audience and the reason they choose to watch films in their native language. This way of thinking is a simplification because on a regular basis, film in languages other than Polish deliver fantastic results at the Polish box office, proving this theory wrong. The reason behind the popularity of Polish productions amongst Poles has more to do with the accuracy of portraying the uniqueness of the country's culture, allowing audiences to recognize familiar worlds with its quirkiness, humor, and authenticity. Generally, these are the reasons why a local film can be popular in any country. Considering the listed factors, so Poland joining the European Union and significant influx of Poles in the UK, establishing Polish Film Institute, and Poles' willingness to watch Polish films, one would expect that the demand for Polish production would be there. So it's worth now analyzing how the process of meeting the demand went. So let's look at that case at the initial titles which were made available to Polish community and also who made them available. Now, this is an interesting thing. It was quite common for the first companies which were distributing Polish films in the UK that they originated from businesses which provided a variety of services for the Polish community. So, for example, the Sarah Inc., which the logo can see on the screen, was initially set up as an accounting and immigration office. However, the owners of the company quickly realized that there are other ways to support Poles living in the UK. A weekly magazine was set up, as well as the Polish radio. So distributing Polish films was actually the next step in the same direction which the company decided to do. So Sarah Inc., as the company, was very active as a distributor between 2011 and 2013. And even until today, one of their most successful titles holds a spot in the top 20 of Polish releases in the UK, because like on the table, which you are looking at, you see the top 20 Polish releases in the UK. And then the release delivered by Sarah Inc. is the last one on the list. So it's actually on the 20th place, the last one on the chart, but it's still holding its place, and the film made 240K in total. Now, the film You Are God made 277K in total, and for 2 years this film represented the highest grossing Polish title in the UK. It was released in 25 cinemas, so taking into consideration that it was released only in 25 cinemas, it's easy to calculate the screen average, which is the last column. It was over £11,000, which is spectacular. Until today, that £11,000 represents the third highest screen average of a Polish film released in the UK. And I also should mention that the film You Are God was released by Project London, which was another distribution company, which was active in a similar time when Sarah Inc. And obviously that one of their titles holds the spot in the top 20. Now, following the time when these two distribution companies, Saraint and Project London, were very active, there was a very quiet period when a very limited number of Polish films was available in cinemas in the UK. And then suddenly, in 2014, 32 audience cinemas were exclusively showing a film called Pitbull New Orders. You can see the poster of that film on the screen. And the film was directed by Patryk Vega. The screen average for this title was quite spectacular as well. It was over 4K during the opening weekend, so it wasn't a surprise that the number of cinemas showing that film was actually increased. So 1, 2, 3 on the fourth column, which is called Locations Weekend, you can see that Pitbull New Orders was shown in 32 locations, but the following week and in total was actually shown in 64 locations, which is like significant increase from the opening weekend to the final number. Eventually, the film made over £500,000 and opened completely new era in terms of availability of Polish titles in cinemas in the UK. Now, so as I mentioned earlier, the film shown in audience cinemas called Pitbull New Orders was directed by Patryk Vega. You can see the gentleman on the screen. And it's worth looking slightly closer at this director's work. So when we review the top 20, the table with top 20 releases in the UK, it's worth noting that out of those 20 titles, 6 of them were made by Patryk Vega. His films are extremely popular. He admits during the interviews that before making a film, he organizes something along the lines of sociological research in order to find out what topic might bring the biggest audience. He's already made a film about mafia women, about politics, about Polish NHS, politics and football, and many more popular topics. He claims that many of the dialogues in his scripts are taken from real situations, and that's one of the reasons why his films resonate with audiences so well. But when reviewing the table with the top 20 Polish releases, it's worth noting that there is another director who has more than one title in the ranking, and that's Paweł Pawlikowski. So 2 of those titles are Cold War and Ida. They are directed by him. Both of them were released by Curzon. And when we look closer at the numbers, we can see that both films, Ida and Cold War, are rare examples when the total number of locations is bigger than the number of cinemas showing the film during the opening weekend. So there's also one additional interesting thing when we look at the numbers, that the opening figure is a very small percentage of the total. Usually it's the opposite when we look at both of those KPIs. And this means that both films benefited from word of mouth and the audience interest was growing rather than diminishing. So Paweł Pawlikowski represents a distinctive filmmaking style. He says, rather than some social document, I want to create a little world that will stay with the audience. Considering the awards which both films won, it's very fair to say that his artistic visions turned him into a very successful filmmaker. Ida won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film, also known as International Film, and that was the first Polish film to do so. And for Cold War, Pawlikowski won the Best Director prize at the Cannes Film Festival and was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Director, while the film received the nomination for the International Film. Now, when reviewing the top 20 titles, it feels mandatory to look at the number 1 title. It's worth noting that the highest grossing Polish title in the UK, it's also the same as the highest grossing title in Poland. And that's Clergy. This is an ambitious drama that skillfully shows clerical representatives as victims as much as villains. The film was directed by Wojciech Smarzowski, who is a very well-known Polish director. As you can imagine, the topic of the film was extremely controversial in the Catholic country like Poland. When the film was in cinemas, people were extremely curious to see it. So all these factors, the director, the topic, and the controversy, guaranteed the commercial success of the film. However, and what was additionally very interesting was how the marketing campaign was run for this film. As I mentioned before, the film is a very ambitious drama which talks about shameful acts conducted by priests. At the same time, it has a lot of dark humor. And that's what the marketing campaign focused on the mocking image of priests. So I strongly believe that many people who decided to watch that film eventually were watching a very different film than they expected. And then in terms of final conclusions now, I do believe that it's worth looking at the chart showing how the number of titles and gross box office fluctuated over the years. So as you can see, the first year after Poland joined the European Union were very slow. And then things picked up around 2011 and up to 2014. That was the time, as I was saying earlier, when Sarah International and when Project London were distributing films. After that, the distribution landscape got very quiet and it erupted again from 2014 following the release of Pitbull. And then it's interesting to look at the huge spike in 2018. A huge spike, actually, it's more relevant for gross box office and less for the number of titles. And the reason is because in 2018, just 2 titles made over £2.5 million. And those 2 titles hold the top 2 spots on the top 20 of the Polish film releases in the UK. And that's Clergy and that's Cold War. And finally, it's understandable, but obviously disappointing to see a big decline since the pandemic. So now, what does the future hold? In order to answer that question, in order to know what to expect, it's crucial to understand the impact of 4 factors, which are crucial when we talk about the Polish cinema in the UK. So obviously the pandemic, that had a very important role in how things evolved. Then Brexit, and then right-wing government in Poland, and finally the collapse of theatrical windows would be additional factor which is key to consider. And yeah, that's it from me. Thank you very much.
I'm back. I think it's okay now. So I think it links very interestingly to what Camila was talking about in the previous session, because we heard a little bit about Colombian cinema, of course, from more historical standpoint point of view, and how kind of the idea of national cinema becomes part of this complex idea of world cinema and how we can really look at it. I think what was interesting about your presentation, you were looking at successful films in Polish cinema and also the links with the UK in terms of what kind of films we could see and what was popular or not. And I was just wondering if you maybe could provide us with some kind of a suggestion. What do you think a Polish cinema could do to become part of this wider world cinema landscape, in a sense of just being present in kind of international arena? And I guess perhaps explain a little bit more why I'm asking about it, because when I think about films like or directors like Paweł Paprocka, Małgorzata Szumowska, these 2 are maybe good examples of directors who are obviously recognized at film festivals. So you were talking about Ida, you were talking about Cold War, really, really acclaimed films. And again, Małgorzata Szumowska, sometimes her films tend to be more popular outside of Poland than in the country. And I was just wondering if you could maybe try to think about any ingredients of Polish cinema which need to happen for us to be able to enjoy it on kind of wider arena, if that makes sense. So it's a complicated question.
Yeah, no worries. So as I was saying, in terms of establishing the Polish Film Institute, that was something what really worked like a magic for Polish cinema, and it really changed the landscape. And I think if we could see the continuation of that process rather than damaging that process, that would be the ideal scenario, basically. So if the right-wing government is equally supportive and things don't change in the wrong direction, so if directors in Poland, they have enough support, they can follow through with their visions, I have absolutely no doubt that Polish cinema can be part of this very wide phenomenon of world cinema. Because what we've seen since 2005, like before the Institute, Polish films were not that visible at the international festivals. Obviously, there were, when they were, it was very much due to political reasons. And obviously, the films which were available, they were great at that time, but the number of titles was very, very limited. And then since the Institute was established, that really positive things started changing in Polish cinema. And exactly, Agata, as you were saying, we started having films at the Berlin Film Festival, Venice Film Festival, in Cannes. So obviously, we love to see this still happening. So yeah, basically the key thing is that the authors, they have the flexibility and they can follow through with their visions.
Thank you. I have another question, but I wanted to first ask Francisco's questions, if that's okay. Thank you, Francisco. So the first one is just wondering how additional funding from film production works in Poland. Do directors rely solely on the public sector?
So it depends on the director and the producer. So obviously, not all the producers and not all films are made with the public funds. So it's interesting to mention Patryk Wega again. He's like extremely successful director in terms of box office, and he doesn't get any public support. He basically makes his films with the money which he's able to sort of combined by himself. So from that perspective, no. And then in terms of Polish Film Institute financing films, there is a very specific way of applying for that funding. So the grants are written, and obviously the producers, they need to apply following a certain regulations. So yeah, that's it's not that easy to get that support from this perspective.
Sorry, I was just muting myself. I can imagine that's never really going to be easy with this kind of thing. So I just wanted to perhaps the last question, just link back to the idea of diverse voices. And I might not be very objective here, but I sometimes feel like when we think about the content of Polish cinema, it's really interesting. We have really great masters, but I sometimes feel there's not much diversity when it comes to what Polish cinema really talks about. And I was wondering if you'd agree with this, or if you feel like we are getting towards more diverse voices, inclusion, if you like, in Polish cinema.
Yeah, from my perspective, we're getting more and more diversity, and also because of that, it's interesting to see that some titles they manage to break this very challenging step when they basically combine being very ambitious and also they are very successful at the box office. So Claire is the best example of that situation. So then and another examples, which obviously I constrained by time, I was not able to talk about, but that would be another interesting topic. So another titles would be Corpus Christi. And so those are the films which are very, as I was saying, very ambitious, and also they manage to attract a lot of their a lot of the audience. So from that perspective, what's happening in Polish cinema is very positive, and I expect that if things are not changed drastically and very negatively, we will be seeing more of those productions.
That's wonderful. That's really helpful. So I'm just going to ask very quickly last questions from Francisco. So Francisco's asking about the name of the festival, which you have mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and whether it accepts films from outside English language.
No, sorry, say that again.
It's about the name of the festival, which you have mentioned at the beginning of the presentation.
Those are not the festivals. It's basically different cinema chains across Europe. They play films not in English, which are for communities. So it works in a similar to the to showing Polish films for Polish community in the UK, or it can be, for example, South Asian films shown for that community in Norway.
Wonderful. Once again, thank you so much, Anya. It was really a pleasure to have you here today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Agata, and all the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we're going to move straight away to our next panelist. So I've seen Rudy being in our audience. Rudy and Charlotte, are you there?
Well, thank you for arranging this conference. Charlotte Deering couldn't be with us today. She's taking her comprehensive exams for her PhD at the University of Oregon. And I wish her luck, because this may be part of her data for the dissertation. We met at Rochester Institute of Technology, and that is also the home of the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. Charlotte is legally deaf and was able to study in New York because of a program called vocational rehabilitation. And we in Rochester have the largest per capita deaf population in the United States. As a result, in Rochester, it's not unusual at public gatherings to see interpreters speaking for whoever is on stage. We also have films that are open captioned exclusively for the deaf. And it's in our classes, we oftentimes have what's called captionists, people who are on a laptop, like court stenographers, taking down whatever the instructor is saying. And the text appears on a screen in front of the deaf students. So we try and accommodate reasonably deaf and hard of hearing as we can. As a result, we looked at how vocational rehabilitation manages to help students try and get an education, and how it helps to prepare them for getting a career. In fact, RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, is known for career-focused education. And so everyone coming into National Technical Institute for the Deaf has to have a LinkedIn account, and they have to maintain it, because the goal of VR is to try and eventually get someone a job. I'll get to American views on social programming a little later. Meanwhile, if you look at what drives our research, it is the muted group theory, which is the idea that groups that are marginalized typically are muted because the language they speak is not dominant. And the dominant group in the society typically chooses this and insists that this is the language of record. So among the deaf community, you'll note that those who consider them deaf with a capital D believe that they are of a culture, and the language they use is American Sign Language. Now, there's also British Sign Language and Black Sign Language and others as well, But ASL is really the one that deaf culture has adopted as its means of communication. Those who consider themselves deaf with a lowercase d typically do not necessarily use ASL. They typically use English or some other language, or perhaps a combination. But if you are part of the deaf culture, capital D, ASL is your main language. Now, in the United States, that particular language was suppressed by those who thought that you should try and make deaf people speak and try and, I guess, compensate for the lack of hearing by lip reading. And this was championed by the person who gave us pretty much our telephone system, Alexander Graham Bell. It didn't work. Oralism has not really caught on. More and more deaf people learn ASL and use that. So unfortunately, if you take a look at the means by which we try and reach deaf people with VR, oftentimes there's very, very little American Sign Language used. In fact, most of the time, it's just straight English or some other languages. America has more than one, although most people believe we speak English only. The truth is there's no main language in the United States. I'll get to how these sites have addressed that. So at RIT, or I should say NTID, almost all the students who are deaf are under some kind of support from vocational rehabilitation. And in the United States, we have roughly 48 million deaf and hard of hearing people. And most of the time, deaf children are born to hearing parents. Now, of course, there's the off chance that a hearing child will be born to a deaf family. This is known as CODA. And there's been an interesting film that Apple produced, an award-winning film about that. But oftentimes you'll find it's mixed. There's deaf and hearing children and parents, and they have to kind of arrange for their education and for their careers by trying to make their way in really a society that doesn't really adjust to ASL that well. As a result, deaf students and hard of hearing go to normal public schools where they are accommodated by some kinds of assistance. They rarely go to deaf schools, and one of the reasons why we have such a high deaf population in Rochester is that it is the home of the Rochester School of the Deaf. So a great many deaf people came here specifically for education. In the rest of the United States, public schools try and mainstream deaf students into regular classes and try and provide them some support so that they can adjust. Now, oftentimes these resources are hard to find because there's not a lot of people who are certified in American Sign Language. In fact, there are only roughly 200 people certified in the United States to be interpreters. Now, we have thousands more that are not certified that do that, but even that is hard to get, even in a place like Rochester. So resources are often lacking. And to make up for this, called vocational rehabilitation, and that provides to interpreters, hearing aids. In my classes, if I have an interpreter, there will be a note because deaf students can't be watching the interpreter and taking notes at the same time. We also have support, at least through VR, for the visually impaired and the blind and the deaf-blind, which have both conditions. And I've had 2 students who are legally deaf and legally blind. So basically, VR, vocational rehabilitation, tries to support people seeking work and education as best it can. But the problem is, even though it's a federal program, the funding comes largely through the states, and every state has a different budget. So if you look at it, the deaf are typically underemployed. One stat has that 53% of deaf people were employed as compared to about 75% of hearing adults. Typically, if the deaf are employed, they make the same amount of money roughly as hearing people. But unfortunately, employment has been kind of stagnant. It has kind of plateaued for deaf people in the US. And what we find is that educational attainment actually can narrow the gap. As a result, we have programs such as NTID, which try to do just that. And that is why career-focused education is really paramount at RIT.
I'm sorry, Rudy. We just realized.
If you look at
we stopped
education, the
showing your
deaf
screen.
typically fall behind, and largely it's because of their lack of ability to understand spoken and written English. As a result, they can excel in other areas, but when it comes time for them to write and comprehend, they typically fall behind other college-educated students and are further disadvantaged because writing and English are not their first languages. So oftentimes we try and overcome the lack of ability with written English by using closed captioning, and that doesn't really work because closed captioning is all text. So the states in the United States have been mandated to make the information available for all people who are interested in vocational rehabilitation. As a result, every state, every protectorate, and the District of Columbia has a VR site. And so we thought, why not take a look and see how well are they outreaching to people who are deaf or hard of hearing. So pretty much VR aims at education and employment, and they do this through grants. And the services vary because some states can afford to pay more. Other states don't see the value of VR. And other states don't have the same level of deaf population as, say, we would in New York. So pretty much VR has been aimed at those with disabilities. And this is a bit of a two-edged sword because the deaf do not consider themselves disabled. They consider themselves a minority culture. So they reject the label of disabled and impaired, but however, they're more than willing to accept the benefits. So there's the two-edged sword. As a result, you'll see that the deaf do take advantage of these programs, but oftentimes they don't exploit them as fully as they could. Here in the United States, unlike other Western industrialized democracies, we have always had a great deal of concern over social programs. So some people think of it as social engineering. And it has always been thought in the United States that the best social program you can give someone is a job. Hence the importance of VR. I would say the US has kind of a love-hate relationship with social programs. We love the ones that we can take advantage of. We hate the ones that are aimed at somebody else. We feel the same way about the people we elect to represent us in our government. We like our own representatives, but we don't like anyone else's. As a result, we have become more or less the disunited states of America. My cousin, who lives about 50 miles from your university in Stoke-on-Trent, thinks of us as a European Union with one language. However, we do have more than one language, and I'll get to how many we really do later on. In the United States, the very first social program effort was the Smith Act, the Smith-Hughes Act, which was aimed at those returning from World War I. And during that war, we had a lot of disabled people. They were called crippled people at that time, people who were missing limbs and who experienced something called shell shock, today we know as post-traumatic stress disorder. And so it all begins with World War I. And after that, it has expanded a little bit in 1918 so that it can extend additional benefits to disabled veterans. And at that time, even the American Red Cross is, I guess, using terms that today we would consider offensive. But the point is that the United States needs everyone to be part of it, and jobs are the way in which we involve everyone. After the next World War, the program expanded to include people who weren't just physically disabled, but also mentally or psychologically disabled. And so the program has grown little by little, and by the 1960s, we were incorporating support for people who have other kinds of problems, such as drug dependency, or people who were ex-cons, as we called them, people who had been convicted of felonies, and other behavioral disorders. It also, and a lot of people think that the Great Society programs of the 1960s didn't work. The truth is that many of them did, and probably one of the most successful is the establishment of the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. And that is where most of the people who are deaf actually get an education. We're far larger than Gallaudet. And it is something where we accommodate the deaf people in ways that you probably wouldn't realize. For instance, the deaf are particularly susceptible to being affected by vibrations. And as a result, we cork the floors in parts of this building right here called the Lyndon Baines Johnson Hall, named after the president who started this. And later on, we got something which was even more important, the Americans with Disabilities Act. This allowed us to build wheelchair ramps and allow access to our students who otherwise might not be able to come physically to class. Now, VR services are also aimed at trying to find people homes and housing where they can live with other people who are disabled or perhaps live alone. And it includes things you might not have thought about. For instance, we probably are all familiar with seeing eye dogs, but did you know that there are hearing ear dogs as well? Realize that the deaf, when they live alone, might not hear, say, a fire alarm going off or a CO2 alarm, or maybe not know that someone is knocking on their door or has rung the doorbell. A properly trained dog can actually inform the deaf about these things, and they can function as a set of ears, much like the seeing eye dog would for the blind. The problem is very few dogs have been trained, and it costs on an average of $30,000 a dog to get them trained. As a result, it's difficult to find, but it is something which can be of great assistance for someone who wants to live independently. VR also provides such things as speech therapy. Oftentimes, the deaf have their own accent and may be difficult to understand. Also, at least VR provides assistive technology such as hearing aids, closed captioning, and other devices that the deaf may find useful, such as bone conduction aids. And of course, interpreting services, particularly for those who are deaf and choose to use American Sign Language as their main language. Now, in order to be eligible for these kinds of programs, you have to demonstrate that you have a barrier that will get in the way of your getting work or of your access to education. So you have to document a need, and then VR will, on a case-by-case basis, decide whether or not to fund you. Only the most severely disabled actually do get funded. In the case of Charlotte, my co-author, she is legally deaf under California standards, even though she can read lips and she has a little bit of hearing, but she functions largely by text and by reading lips. So we had, in looking at the VR sites, we had a number of questions, one of which was, what information does VR present to people who are seeking help in finding education and employment? Second, we wanted to know, does the information really address those who are deaf and hard of hearing? And finally, what could be done to improve those sites to better accommodate those reasonably? Our method was content analysis, and we looked at all 56 websites that VR has. Those include the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the 5 U.S. territories. Believe it or not, only 54% of Americans actually know that Puerto Rico is part of the United States. I'm sad to admit it, but it's true. Most people don't know if these territories really do belong to the U.S. Now, we looked at them and analyzed them in terms of 5 broad categories: content, usability, interactivity, transparency, and audience. By audience, we mean the level to which they distinguish between deaf, hard of hearing, blind, and disabled. The features were coded as to whether they were present or absent. So they got a 1 if they were there, a 0 if they did not. Here's what content looked like under our check sheet. Note that some things were going to be obvious, like physical addresses of the offices, fax numbers, email addresses. But for our purposes, we're more interested in the assistive technologies and whether or not there was a separate site specifically for the blind. Under usability, we looked to see if they had additional languages, because there are more than certainly one language in the United States. Whether or not they provided video in ASL, because text is not the way ASL is actually used. Also, we wanted to know if they closed caption their video. The good thing is, if they put their video on YouTube, you can automatically close caption it, and that gets you out of some expense and some difficulty in doing so. Third category was interactivity, and we wanted to know to what extent they allowed toll-free numbers, because in the United States, if you make a call outside your area call, you are charged for that, unless you have a plan, which is universal. Furthermore, we wanted to know if they supported telecommunications relay services. This allows deaf people to communicate by text, by sign, by speech-to-speech, by perhaps with people who do not speak English, and by closed captioning. These are available pretty much throughout the entire United States, and we wanted to see to what extent they're present on the sites. We also looked at how much they told people about themselves. In other words, how much did the site reveal about who runs the site, who's responsible, who to contact, and what policies are in place. Do they track you? Are there cookies? Do they edit what you post, and so forth? The last and the fifth category is the audience, and this refers to how well they distinguish between the types of people accessing their sites, whether they address the deaf and hard of hearing, those who are deaf, deaf and blind, and those who are brain injured. At least that's what it used to be called. Today, I guess they call them intellectual disabilities. So here's what we found. Only 24 out of 56 sites actually offered content in languages other than English. Now, despite the belief that America has only English, the truth is there are a great many languages, and by law, we are supposed to support 6 of them. Now, Minnesota and Dakota actually had everything from Afrikaans to Zulu, and I mean that not geographically, but in terms of alphabetically. Afrikaans to Zulu would just be one continent, but all of the languages of the world are present on those 2 sites, but nowhere else. Ohio, unfortunately, had a translator that you had to use part of your browser to translate for you, and unfortunately, it did not work. Puerto Rico surprised us in that it had ASL, but it was entirely in Spanish. The closed captioning even was in Spanish. There was no English whatsoever on the site. In fact, I downloaded the the actual video itself, and you can see
Rudy,
it provides
can
closed
you hear
caption
me?
as well as
Rudy,
video and audio.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me? I just wanted to make you aware that we couldn't actually see the presentation. I put it in a chat, but we've lost your presentation a couple of slides in. So what I'm going to ask you, perhaps after the presentation, if you could be so kind to share it with us, and I'll make sure we include it in Expo so we can link what you're saying to the actual slides. Would that be okay?
Yes, I'll just extemporize then, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. All right. Let's see, where am I? All right. Only 29 of the states actually had closed captioning, which completely leaves the deaf out. 28 had posted their videos to YouTube, which allows it to be closed captioned, and only 29 had telecommunications relay services. Only 38 out of 56 had toll-free numbers, and only 28 used relay calls. 39 had content specifically tailored for students, and only 24 had any information at all about hearing aids. Only 2 mentioned cochlear implants. Cochlear implants are well, it's kind of a flashpoint with deaf culture. People who are deaf with a capital D don't believe in cochlear implants. They discourage people from having them and believe that it is something which will ultimately kill deaf culture if everyone were to get them. Only 24 sites had any information about hearing aids. Only 17 had a separate site for the blind. So here are our recommendations. More of the sites have to have ASL. Without that, the deaf culture is completely left out. So only 8 sites allow for the deaf to actually access their content. Furthermore, I can recall back in the days when I entered television production, in order to edit video, we were looking at roughly $40,000 to have videotape recorders, time-based correction, editing control units, monitors, and so forth. Today, you just need a phone. Video is neither difficult nor expensive to script, shoot, edit, or post. And you don't need a soundtrack or even too much editing in order to do it. In fact, many of the videos I've seen, which are in ASL, are just one shot with no editing. If an audio track is included, YouTube will close caption it for you for free, and you don't have to go through the expense or the time of getting it closed caption. Furthermore, the United States has no official language. More languages need to be used and supported by these sites. We have a total of roughly 331 million people in the United States, 381 different spoken languages. 39 million speak Spanish. And the US Census now is available in 13 languages. In other words, the questionnaire is available in 13 languages, but the glossaries and other parts of it, and even the instructions, are available in ASL. In fact, if you want to look at the glossaries, there are 59 languages represented. I don't understand why they don't have telecommunications relay services for all sites. Only 28 sites have them, when really they're available in all 50 sites, the District of Columbia, and all of our protectorates. It is free for companies. The telephone providers, the telephone companies, are compensated by the government, and there's never any cost to the user. So why don't they do that? Also, these services accommodate all forms of hearing loss and a number of foreign languages as well. We know that the VR program has been successful, but unfortunately, there are questions of differences with regard to states, since they all fund it differently and offer different varieties of support. However, if you take a look at what they need to do to accommodate the deaf and the hard of hearing, much can be achieved with very, very little effort and not much money at all. All you need is a phone and an interpreter. One of the things we'd like to do as a result of this study is perhaps to produce a template of all of the things that should be provided by all of the 56 sites. That may be the bare minimum or the floor below which they ought not go. And in that way, they could accommodate people who are disabled in one way or another, but particularly the deaf and hard of hearing community.
Just a friendly reminder, Rudy, we have only 3 minutes left. So if you don't
I'm
mind.
sorry.
No
Yes.
And then hopefully we still have time for some questions. So I'll let you just wrap it up, and then we open for questions, if that's okay.
Okay. Well, I'm done.
All right. Thank you. Let me just open my camera here. Thank you so much. That was just so interesting. And again, like, I'm really amazed how all the panels and all the sessions we have so far link so nicely to the idea of diverse voices. And obviously, in your case, that was just really explicit in terms of talking about deaf communities. And what was really striking for me is this idea of technologies and how they create these kind of connections. In this case, for people with who are hard of hearing. Would you mind expand on your opinion about this role of technologies in creating these connections for this specific community?
Mm-hmm. We have another study that we've done, which analyzes what people talk about on social media who are deaf and hard of hearing. So we've looked at a subreddit called Deaf and Hard of Hearing, or DHH. And what we find is that most of the time, the deaf talk about technologies because they need, let's say, support for hearing. And on these social media sites, they ask about what they can do to, I guess, adjust for a loss of hearing. They also ask for recommendations for an audiologist, what types of hearing aids work well with the type of loss they have, how they can interpret an audiogram. So oftentimes what the deaf talk about are assistive devices and ways in which they can sort of overcome barriers to communication. And the thing they most talk about is communication itself. There's a subreddit particularly for American Sign Language only. But what we found is that they like to talk about how to interact with each other, what would be socially acceptable and what would not. Sometimes we find that they even talk about how to date someone who's deaf, or if someone's deaf, how to date someone who's hearing, should you order at a restaurant for them, and so forth. So there's all these conversations about communication.
So
But
interesting.
chief among them is the way in which they would use technology.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I can see how that links to our event really. Like we talk when you were talking about it, I find it really striking how obviously we're talking about connections, communities, and yet this is this big international conference which happens completely online for the very reason that we have people like yourself joining us from different corners of the world. So again, perhaps this is the idea for our next theme for the next conference, how the role of technologies for connections and communities. So I think you just inspired us. Really, thank you so much. It was really, really inspiring. I'm sorry that Charlotte wasn't here with you, but thank you so much also to her. I want to extend my gratitude to both of you for preparing this really fascinating paper. So really, really thank you. So this concludes our second panel. We now going to have an hour break before we move on to panel 3 on innovation and foresight. So I think I'll invite everyone to take this opportunity to engage with our expo section. So we already had lots of people this morning, including our keynote speaker, Agnieszka, who talked about films, and those films can be accessed on the expo sessions. We were going to keep it for our closing words, but I think it's a good opportunity to also invite you to engage with the films which are going to be explored tomorrow in the Filmmakers Insight session. So this is where we invited selected filmmakers whose films are in the expo sessions to talk a little bit more about their practice. So I think this is a good time for you to grab another coffee, engage with those films, and we will see you at 5 o'clock, so in 1 hour, in session number 3. Thank you so much.